The air over Persepolis shimmered like a mirage of gold and ash. The great capital of the Persian Empire, heart of kings, seat of empires, lay broken beneath a rising sun. The banners of Macedon, dusted with blood, hung above its marble gates. Alexander, son of Philip, stood upon the terrace of Darius's palace, where the wind carried the scent of smoke, honey, and death. He was 26 years old, and the world already trembled at his name. Yet his eyes, blue and shadowed beneath the iron rim of his helmet, betrayed something more than triumph. They carried the weight of a prophecy fulfilled too soon. Behind him, his generals gathered like restless wolves, Parmenian, stern and weary, Hephaestion, loyal and silent, and the veterans who had crossed deserts and mountains to see Persia fall. Below, the city moaned. The soldiers of Macedon plundered as conquerors always did. Silk, gold, and ivory spilled into the streets like rivers of fire. The temples bled their treasures. Statues of forgotten gods shattered under foreign boots. Yet Alexander's gaze was fixed not on the looting but on the palace itself, the house of Darius, built for eternity. There the royal family had sought refuge during the chaos. There, hidden behind curtains of Tyrian purple, the wives and daughters of Darius III awaited their fate. Alexander dismounted. The silence of the hall met him like a breath from another world. He walked past burning braziers and reliefs of ancient kings until he reached the royal chamber. 3 women stood before him, veiled but proud, their faces streaked with dust and tears. Behind them knelt attendants, trembling yet defiant. The eldest, Stateira, Darius's queen, stepped forward. Her voice was steady, though her world had fallen. "If you have come to mock us, conqueror, do it swiftly. The gods have already judged Persia." Alexander did not answer at once. He removed his helmet, revealing the youth beneath the conqueror, the boy who had once studied under Aristotle, who had dreamt not of gold but of glory. "I have not come to mock you," he said. "Your husband fled the field at Gaugamela. I did not kill him, nor will I harm his family." Stateira searched his face for deceit and found none. She sank to her knees, not in submission but exhaustion. The princesses followed, Barsine, Drypetus, and the younger Stateira II, who could not have been more than 15. Their jewels were gone, their robes torn, yet their bearing was still royal. Alexander turned to Hephaestion. "See that no man lays a hand upon them," he said. "They are under my protection." The order spread quickly through the ranks. The soldiers, drunk with victory, grumbled but obeyed. The royal women were moved to guarded quarters, treated not as slaves but as honored captives. That night, Alexander stood alone in the great hall of Persepolis. Torches flickered on the carved faces of Achaemenid kings, Cyrus, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, all staring down at the foreign intruder who had ended their line. He thought of his mother Olympias, fierce and prophetic, who had told him he was destined to rule as a god among men. But gods, he realized, do not dream of peace. He poured wine onto the marble floor and whispered to the ghosts, "I have not come to destroy you, but to surpass you." Yet outside, Persepolis burned. The Macedonians, unable to restrain their fury, set fire to the lower city. Flames licked the palace walls, turning the night crimson. In the captive quarters, Stateira and her daughters watched the sky blaze. "So ends the house of Darius," the queen said softly. The youngest, Stateira II, turned to her mother. "Will he kill us?" "No," the queen replied. "He is not that kind of man. But he will take from us something far greater than life, our history." As dawn approached, Alexander returned to the royal quarters. He had heard that the captives wept through the night. When he entered, they rose in silence. He looked upon them, not as trophies but as relics of a fallen empire he had once envied. He spoke quietly. "You are not my enemies. Your king still lives. If the gods will it, I shall meet him again, not in anger, but in destiny." And with that, the conqueror who had burned the greatest city of the East bowed to the women of his enemy. Outside, Persepolis still smoked, its gold melting into the earth. The morning after Persepolis burned, the air still carried the bitter perfume of ash and cedar. Alexander's army rested among the ruins of its own triumph. Soldiers staggered through the streets like ghosts, their armor tarnished with soot, their eyes glazed with the fever of conquest. But within the high-walled compound of the royal quarters, silence reigned. The captives, Queen Stateira and her daughters Barsine, Drypetus, and young Stateira II, were given rooms that had once belonged to the king's concubines. Macedonian guards stood outside, stern but respectful. The women were not chained. Alexander had forbidden it, yet the walls themselves felt like chains closing in with each passing hour. Barsine, the eldest daughter, watched the soldiers through a slit in the lattice. She was sharp-minded, the one who had once studied politics at her father's court. She understood that mercy from a conqueror was often more dangerous than his wrath. Mercy bound you to gratitude, to silence, to slow erasure. "He says we are honored guests," she murmured. "Guests do not have guards at their doors." Queen Stateira did not answer. Her eyes were fixed on a tapestry half-burned by the fire, an image of Darius offering tribute to Ahura Mazda. The queen's face was calm, but inside her, a quiet terror gnawed at the edges of her dignity. She had seen empires rise and fall. She knew what came next. That afternoon, Alexander entered the quarters alone, unarmed. The guard stepped aside. He wore a simple tunic of white linen, unmarked by rank or jewels. He looked less like a conqueror and more like a philosopher who had wandered into the wrong century. The women rose. He bowed slightly, a gesture no Macedonian king had ever made to a captive. "You have nothing to fear," he said softly. "I have ordered my men to honor you as they would their own queens." Barsine's eyes narrowed. "You speak of honor, yet our city burns. What honor lies in that?" Her words struck him harder than she knew. For a moment the confident conqueror faltered. "The fire," he said after a pause, "was not my command. Soldiers lose themselves in victory. Even kings cannot master the madness of men." Stateira studied him. His face bore no cruelty, only weariness, the exhaustion of one who had achieved what he desired and found it hollow. "You are young," she said. "Too young to carry the ghosts of nations." Alexander met her gaze. "Perhaps, but youth does not spare one from destiny." He left them food, clothing, and attendance. He ordered that the royal family's servants captured elsewhere be reunited with them. He spoke to the women not as prisoners but as peers, curious, respectful, and strangely gentle. Yet the soldiers whispered. Some said the king had fallen under the spell of the Persian queen's beauty. Others claimed he sought to claim Darius's throne not by conquest but by blood, by wedding the royal line to his own. Parmenion, his oldest general, did not hide his disapproval. "You show them too much kindness," he warned. "They will see mercy as weakness." The men already murmur. "They did not march across Asia to see you dine with your enemies' wives." Alexander's reply was cold. "We did not march across Asia to remain barbarians." But at night, when the wine ran low and silence fell, even Alexander doubted himself. He walked through the ruined palace, tracing his fingers along walls carved with cuneiform prayers to forgotten gods. He saw the throne of Darius, the gold melted by fire, and thought of how quickly a name could vanish from the world. He wondered if his own name would someday be carved into stone only to be swallowed by dust. Days turned into weeks. The women adapted to their new life. Queen Stateira prayed each morning facing the rising sun as she had always done. Barsine began to speak with the Macedonian officers, learning their language. Drypetus kept to herself, sketching on scraps of parchment, recording what she saw so that her people would not be erased from memory. Alexander visited often, speaking with them of philosophy, of war, of fate. To Barsine he confessed that he had been tutored by Aristotle, that he sought not just conquest but knowledge. She listened carefully and in time began to see the man beneath the crown. But not everyone approved. One evening, Clitus the Black, one of Alexander's most loyal captains, entered his tent in anger. "We fought for Macedonia, not for Persia," Clitus thundered. "Your men grow restless. They see their king dressing in silk, bowing to queens who should be spoils, not sovereigns." Alexander's temper flared, but he restrained himself. "Tell them," he said, "that I conquer not to destroy, but to unite. The Persians call me invader. I will make them call me king." Outside, thunder rolled over the plain. And in the royal quarters, Barsine dreamed of a world where Persians and Macedonians might share more than hatred. She dreamed of her father's defeat and the strange kindness of the man who had taken everything from her. A messenger arrived days later with news. Darius III still lived. He had fled east, raising what was left of his armies in Bactria. Alexander's eyes burned with a new fire. The war was not over. The chase would begin again. Before departing, he visited the captives one last time. "When I return," he told them, This war will end, for you and for me. If I fall, I ask only this, remember that I sought to be more than a destroyer. Queen Stateira bowed her head. If you fall, she said, may the gods judge you by the mercy you showed the defeated. When Alexander left Persepolis, he looked back only once. Smoke still curled over the city, but in his mind he carried the memory of the road east from Persepolis stretched across a wasteland of wind and silence. The fires of the Persian capital had long faded behind them, but their smoke seemed to cling to the Macedonian banners like a curse. Alexander rode at the head of his army, eyes fixed on the horizon. Every morning scouts brought the same report. Darius still flees. For months, the Persian king had evaded capture, retreating deeper into his empire's bones. Through the deserts of Parthia, the mountains of Hyrcania, and the valleys of Media. His army was shattered, but his presence still haunted the east like a shadow that refused to die. Alexander's pursuit was relentless. He crossed rivers swollen with spring rain, rode through sandstorms that blinded horses and pushed his men until even the veterans muttered prayers to foreign gods. He told them it was not vengeance that drove him, but destiny, that until Darius was brought to justice, the world would remain divided. Yet those closest to him saw something else. The fever in his eyes, the restless silence that settled over him when he looked to the stars at night. Hephaestion, ever his confidant, rode beside him one evening as the army camped near Ecbatana. You chase a man already defeated, Hephaestion said quietly. Why not stop here? Rule what you have taken. Alexander stared into the distance where the mountains rose like walls against the dusk. Because Darius still breathes. And while he breathes, the old world still lives. Hephaestion nodded, though his heart was heavy. He had seen his friend become something greater and more terrible than the student of Aristotle could ever have imagined. At Ecbatana, they found what was left of Darius's court, ministers, scribes, and soldiers who had surrendered out of hunger and despair. Among them were servants who had once attended the royal family. When they were brought before Alexander, they knelt in silence. He asked them of Darius's whereabouts. He goes east, one said, but not alone. The satrap Bessus has taken him under protection. Alexander's expression hardened. He knew Bessus, the governor of Bactria, proud and ambitious, a man who bowed to kings only until he could replace them. That night, as torches burned low, Alexander studied a map drawn on a deerskin. His generals argued around him. Parmenion urged caution. The roads to Bactria are long and treacherous. The men are weary. We have enough gold to last 10 lifetimes. But Alexander looked up, his voice quiet and cutting. I did not cross the world to turn back at a mountain. And so, once more they marched, through narrow passes where ambushes lurked, across plains where the wind howled like wolves. The mountains of the Hindu Kush loomed ahead, white with snow. Men began to die not from battle but from exhaustion and frostbite. Horses stumbled and soldiers fell asleep standing, their faces pale as marble. Still Alexander pressed on, his cloak whipping in the icy wind. At last news reached them in a small valley near Hekatompolos. A Persian deserter brought word that Darius was dead. The camp froze at the words. Alexander demanded proof. The deserter dropped a bundle at his feet, a blood-stained cloak, a royal seal, and a dagger of Persian gold. Bessus killed him, the man said. He called himself the new great king. Darius was wounded and left in a wagon. He begged his men to flee before Alexander came. When we found him, he was still alive, asking for you. The wind fell silent. For a long time, no one spoke. Alexander knelt, his hands tightening around the bloodied seal, the mark of the Achaemenid kings. In that moment, triumph and grief became indistinguishable. He had conquered the empire of Darius, but the man himself had been denied to him. When the soldiers buried Darius's body under a mound of stones, Alexander stood over the grave in silence. You were a king, he said at last, and I am sorry that you died not as a king but as a fugitive. The gods have judged us both. He ordered that Darius be buried with royal honors, his body returned to Persia under guard. To those who doubted his sincerity, he said, the great king has fallen, but his empire shall not fall with him. Days later, the Macedonian army entered Bactria. There Bessus had already proclaimed himself Artaxerxes' fifth heir to Persia. Alexander summoned his generals. Bessus thinks he can wear the crown of Darius, he said. Let him learn that kingship is not taken, It is earned. The hunt began again, this time not for an enemy but for a traitor. Villages that had once resisted Darius now welcomed Alexander as the avenger of their murdered king. Word spread quickly. The foreign conqueror had wept for Persia's fallen ruler. In the royal quarters left behind at Persepolis, Queen Stateira and her daughters heard the news of Darius's death. Barsine wept openly. The queen did not. She sat before a small flame, whispering a prayer to the God of truth. He is gone, she said to her daughters, but perhaps the man who chased him will honor what he could not claim. And indeed, when word reached Alexander that the women still lived under his protection, he sent new orders. They were to be treated as royal kin, not prisoners. He spoke to Hephaestion that night. I have taken Darius's empire, he said, but not his enemies. I have become the man I once sought to destroy. Hephaestion looked at him. Then what will you do? I will finish what he began, Alexander replied, and make a single world, one crown, one people, one destiny. But even as he said the words, a storm gathered over the mountains, the first whisper of rebellion in the east, and the first crack in the armor of a man who had begun to believe himself divine. Bactria, the capital of the far eastern provinces, was a city of cold winds and high walls. Its streets were narrow, its palaces austere, built more for endurance than beauty. Here, among snow-capped mountains and stony rivers, Alexander made his new seat of power. But though the banners of Macedon now hung over Persia's last stronghold, a shadow moved through the camp, the shadow of Darius, and the weight of what his death had cost. Alexander spent hours alone in his tent, studying Persian texts and royal decrees. He ordered that Darius's seal be sent to Babylon to be kept beside his own. Some said he spoke to it at night as if seeking counsel from the dead king. The generals watched with unease. Parmenion warned him, "You cannot rule Asia by becoming Persian." But Alexander only smiled faintly. "Perhaps I cannot rule it any other way." He began to wear Persian robes at court, long silk tunics embroidered with gold, soft leather shoes in place of Macedonian boots. He adopted the title Shahanshah, the King of Kings, and demanded that visiting nobles bow before him as Persian subjects had once bowed before Darius. The Macedonian officers murmured among themselves. To them, such gestures smelled of betrayal. Macedon's sons had bled for this conquest. They had not crossed deserts and mountains to see their king crowned in foreign silk. At night, in the flicker of oil lamps, Alexander would pace the marble floors of the palace, whispering to himself, "I did not kill him, but I took everything he had. What then am I to his gods?" Hephaestion, the one man who could still speak plainly to him, found him there one night staring out over the dark city. "You are not yourself," Hephaestion said softly. "You have won the world and lost your peace." Alexander turned to him, eyes hollow. "I see Darius in every dream. I see the fire at Persepolis. I see the faces of those who followed me from Greece to the edge of the earth. Tell me, Hephaestion, how does a man stop being a conqueror?" Hephaestion had no answer. He had followed Alexander since they were boys. He had seen the cost of his destiny and loved him still, but even he could feel something shifting, an invisible line being crossed between man and myth. Meanwhile, unrest brewed among the troops. The men who had once cheered his every command now grumbled in their tents. Clitus the Black, proud and outspoken, was their voice. "He forgets who we are," Clitus told the soldiers. "We are Macedonians, not Persians. We kneel to no man." Others nodded in silence. They had followed Alexander through plague and starvation, but now he seemed to worship the very gods of the enemies they had slain. Word of this reached Alexander. He summoned Clitus to his chamber. The general entered without bowing. His armor still bore the scars of battle. "You sent for me, my king?" he asked, his tone edged with defiance. Alexander studied him for a long time. "You served me well," he said at last. "You saved my life at Granicus. But do you now think me less your king because I wear a different robe?" Clitus did not flinch. "I think you forget who made you king. We marched beside you, not beneath you. Now you bow to foreign customs, dine with captive queens, and call yourself a god. Is that what Macedonia fought for?" The air between them tightened like a drawn bowstring. For a moment it seemed Alexander might strike him. Instead he turned away. "Leave me," he said quietly, "before I forget that you once saved my life." Clitus left in silence. But the words hung heavy in the camp. That night, Alexander ordered more Persian nobles into his council, replacing several Macedonian officers. Days later, a messenger arrived from Persepolis bearing a letter sealed in gold. It was from Queen Stateira, written in careful Greek. To Alexander, conqueror of my husband's empire, I have heard of Darius's death. I grieve not for his crown, but for the manner of his passing. They say you buried him as a king. For that I offer thanks, but I ask you this, will you honor his house or only his memory? The daughters of Persia still live in your care. Do not let mercy become another form of conquest. Alexander read the letter many times. He had ordered that the royal family remain safe, yet her words pierced him. It was spring again when Alexander returned to Persepolis. A year had passed since its fall, yet the city still smelled of smoke. Charred columns rose against the sky like the bones of a dead god. The once golden gates of Darius's palace had blackened to ash, but the carvings of the old king still stared down, unbroken by time or conquest. Alexander rode through the ruined streets in silence. Behind him trailed his court, Macedonian generals, Persian nobles, courtiers in bright robes, all of them watching their king with uncertain eyes. He had come not to conquer, but to remember. When they reached the palace terrace, he dismounted and walked to the edge where the wind carried dust from the desert below. His gaze fell on the city that had once been the jewel of Asia, the heart of an empire older than his ancestors' gods. He thought of Darius's family, still living somewhere under his protection. He thought of the Persian scribes, the poets, the soldiers who had died defending this place. He also thought of the cheers of his men, the endless thirst that drove them eastward. It was for them that Persepolis had burned once before, and it would be his own soul that burned for it forever. That night Alexander held a great feast in the Hall of 100 Columns, what remained of it. The air was heavy with wine and the scent of torch oil. Musicians played foreign melodies on Persian lutes. Dancers, veiled in silk, moved like shadows through the smoke. The conqueror who had become a god sat at the head of the table, his golden cup always full. Clitus was there, though his eyes were dark with resentment. Hephaestion sat beside Alexander, saying little. Among the guests was Thais, a courtesan from Athens known for her beauty and her sharp tongue. She had followed the army for years, a companion of soldiers and kings alike. As the night grew older and the wine heavier, Thais rose and addressed the hall. "My lord," she said with a wicked smile, "you have conquered the world, but you have not yet avenged Greece." The generals murmured, unsure of what she meant. "Look around you," she continued. "This is Persepolis, the city that sent armies against Athens, that burned our temples, that defiled our gods. And here we sit, drinking beneath its roof like guests instead of avengers." Alexander's eyes flickered with both amusement and unease. "And what would you have me do, Thais?" he asked. Her voice cut through the music. "Do what the gods demand. Burn the city as they once burned ours. Let Persepolis pay for Xerxes' sins." The hall fell silent. Then one by one the Macedonians began to cheer. "Burn it," they cried. "Burn Persepolis for Greece." The Persians at the table turned pale, but none dared speak. Alexander rose slowly, his face lit by torchlight. In that moment he looked less like a man and more like the spirit of vengeance itself. "Very well," he said at last. "Let the city burn. Tonight, Greece shall have its justice." They staggered out into the night, torches blazing, wine spilling onto the marble floors. Alexander led the procession through the palace halls, Thais walking beside him, laughing, her hair catching sparks from the flames. The soldiers shouted hymns of conquest, their footsteps echoing like thunder through the corridors. When they reached the royal audience chamber, Alexander stopped. Before him stood the throne of Darius, half buried in ash. He raised his torch and hesitated. In his mind, he heard Queen Stateira's voice. "Do not let mercy become another form of conquest." He saw Darius's grave, the cold mountains of Bactria, the faces of the dead. But the crowd roared, and the fire in their eyes was stronger than the doubt in his heart. With a cry that was half triumph, half despair, Alexander hurled the torch. Flames leapt up the silk draperies, racing along the carved walls like serpents. The roof timbers caught, snapping in bursts of sparks. Within minutes, the palace of the great kings was an inferno. The heat drove them back into the courtyard, where the soldiers cheered and danced in the firelight. Thais threw her arms around Alexander's neck and shouted, "Now you are truly avenged." But Alexander's smile had vanished. He watched the fire consume everything. The painted walls, the golden statues, the tablets that bore the names of ancient kings. He saw the faces of his men reflected in the flames, twisted with joy and madness. And for the first time he felt fear, not of death but of himself. By dawn, Persepolis was gone. The fire had devoured it all. The wind carried only ashes across the desert. When the sun rose, Alexander walked alone through the ruins. His sandals crunched on the charred remains of what had once been the greatest city in the world. Hephaestion found him there, standing before the blackened throne. "You did what the army wanted," Hephaestion said softly. "You gave them vengeance." Alexander's voice was hollow. "No, I gave them madness, and it has burned my soul as surely as it burned this city." He knelt beside the ruins, pressing his hand to the cold stone. "Forgive me, Darius," he whispered. "Forgive me, Persia." Then he rose and gave a single order to his men. "We march east at sunrise." That night, the wind howled through the empty halls of Persepolis, carrying the last whispers of the Achaemenid Empire into the desert, and far away in the camp of the royal captives, Queen Stateira looked toward the horizon where a faint glow still burned. "He has destroyed what he sought to rule," she said quietly. "Now he must learn what it means to be king of ashes." The snows of Sogdiana melted into rivers that tore through the valleys of Bactria, a land of stone fortresses and stubborn hearts. Alexander's army, weary from years of marching, arrived there not as heroes but as strangers surrounded by mountains that seemed to reject them. The Bactrians had never bowed easily to any empire, not to Darius, and certainly not to the son of Philip. Their chiefs hid in mountain strongholds, striking at the Macedonians from cliffs and caves. Every road was an ambush, every shepherd a spy. Alexander rode at the head, his cloak lined with dust, his eyes darker than ever. The flames of Persepolis still haunted him. Even his victories tasted like ashes, yet he pressed on. The empire could not rest while a single province resisted. He established his camp near a fortress called Sogdian Rock, a citadel perched on a sheer cliff. The locals said even eagles could not reach its walls. There, the remnants of Bactrian resistance had gathered, led by a nobleman named Oxyartes. When the Macedonian heralds called for surrender, the defenders shouted back mockingly, "When your soldiers grow wings, you may take our fortress." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "Then we shall find men who can fly." That night he summoned his best climbers, hunters from Macedonia and mountaineers from the Caucasus. Under cover of darkness they scaled the icy cliffs with iron spikes and ropes, some falling to their deaths, others clawing upward through snow and silence. By dawn 100 men had reached the summit. They waved their weapons from the heights as the rising sun caught their armor. When the Bactrians looked up and saw them, their courage broke. They opened the gates, stunned that the impossible had been done. Among the captives brought before Alexander was Roxana, the daughter of Oxyartes. She was not draped in royal finery, but in a simple robe of white wool, her hair braided in the Bactrian style. Her face bore neither fear nor defiance, only calm. Alexander studied her for a long time before speaking. "You are Oxyartes' daughter?" "Yes," she said. "And you are the man who claims to rule us." Her tone was even, her words precise. The court fell silent, expecting punishment. But Alexander only smiled faintly. "Then perhaps I should learn what it means to rule Bactria, from one who has lived it." He treated her not as a prisoner, but as a guest. When Oxyartes sent envoys to negotiate peace, Alexander welcomed them and restored their lands. He invited the Bactrian nobles to his table and declared that the days of vengeance were over. But to many of his men, it was a strange peace. They saw their king, once fierce and unbending, now walking with a woman from among the conquered. He spoke of unity, of blending Greek and Persian blood, of an empire not divided by race but bound by destiny. At night, in the quiet of his tent, Alexander spoke to Hephaestion. "She reminds me of what I sought to build," he said softly. "Not a kingdom of conquest, but of understanding." Hephaestion, ever loyal, replied, "And yet understanding will win you fewer soldiers than fear." Still, Alexander continued to meet with Roxana, discussing the customs of her people, their songs, Their gods, their stories of the mountains. She challenged him, questioned him, even teased him for his ambition. You wish to unite the world, she told him once, but you do not see how many worlds live within one heart. As the weeks passed, a strange calm settled over the camp. Oxyartes swore loyalty, and the last of the Bactrian rebels surrendered. For the first time in years, there was no immediate war. In that fragile peace, Alexander made a decision that shocked his court. He would marry Roxana. The announcement spread through the ranks like wildfire. Some celebrated it as a symbol of harmony. Others whispered that their king had been bewitched. Clitus, ever outspoken, spat upon the ground. We marched from Greece to see him crowned with laurel, he said bitterly, and now he wears a Bactrian wedding garland. But Alexander ignored them. He called for a simple ceremony in a mountain courtyard, beneath a clear blue sky. Persian musicians played soft melodies. Macedonian officers stood uneasily beside Bactrian nobles. Roxana wore no jewels, only a silver band across her brow and a white veil that fluttered in the wind. When she entered, Alexander rose. This is no conquest, he said to those assembled. The dawn after his marriage to Roxana broke golden over the Bactrian hills. For the first time in many months, Alexander did not wake to the sound of marching horns or clashing armor. Instead, the camp stirred with the low hum of construction, masons shaping stone, soldiers planting the first markers of Alexandria Eshate, the city that would crown his eastern frontier. But the silence of peace carried a strange weight. To the Macedonian veterans, the king's new ways were unsettling. Their once simple general, who had slept among them on the cold ground, who had eaten from their plates, now surrounded himself with Persian nobles, scholars, and priests. He had begun to wear a flowing robe of white silk, the traditional garb of the great kings. His beard, once neatly trimmed in the Greek fashion, grew longer. And worst of all, he had begun to demand that his men prostrate themselves before him, the Persian act of proskynesis. To the Persians, it was a gesture of divine respect. To the Macedonians, it was humiliation. In the grand hall of his new palace, Alexander received ambassadors from across the empire, from Egypt, Babylon, Media, and the edge of India. The air was perfumed with incense, the walls draped in tapestries embroidered with scenes of gods and lions. Musicians played softly as courtiers entered and bowed to the floor. Then came his Macedonian generals, Clitus, Parmenian's son Philotas, and a host of old comrades who had fought beside him since childhood. They hesitated at the threshold. "Must we kneel before you now, Alexander?" Clitus said coldly. "You kneel before the idea that binds our empire," the king replied, "not before the man." "We followed you because you were one of us," Clitus answered, his voice rising. "Now you would have us crawl like Persians." The court fell silent. Alexander's expression hardened. "And what would you have me do? Rule Persia as a Macedonian? Rule Macedonia as a Persian? Shall I divide my own soul for your comfort?" Clitus glared, but he said no more. The wound was open, and it would fester. Roxana entered then, dressed in pale blue silk, her hair braided in silver thread. The sight of her only deepened the unease of the Macedonians, who whispered that she had bewitched their king. Yet to the Persians, she was a living symbol of reconciliation, the bridge between two worlds. She approached Alexander quietly and spoke in Persian. "Your people do not yet understand you." He replied in the same tongue. "They will, when I have shown them what this empire can become." Then, seeing the discontented faces of his generals, he added softly, "Or they will die refusing to see." The months that followed were filled with transformation. Alexander adopted Persian administrative customs. He appointed satraps to govern provinces. He re-established temples desecrated by his own soldiers years before. He invited Persian scholars to teach in his court, poets to sing in their ancient tongue, and artisans to blend Hellenic and Eastern designs. In Babylon, he ordered the reconstruction of Marduk's temple, a gesture that shocked his Greek advisors. In Susa, he planned a grand ceremony to unite his soldiers and Persian women in mass marriage, a gesture of peace through union. Roxana watched him tirelessly, half in awe, half in fear. "You would make gods of men," she told him once, "but men do not wear divinity well." Then they must learn, he said. If I cannot teach them, no one will. But beneath the gold and silk, rebellion stirred like fire beneath dry reeds. In secret, Macedonian officers met by torchlight whispering of home. They were men who had left Greece as boys and grown old in deserts and mountains. They dreamed of return, to Pella, to the sea, to the lives they had left behind. Alexander is no longer ours, one said. He eats with Persians, he prays to their gods. And now another spat. He calls himself the son of Ammon, a god. Clitus slammed his fist against the table. He forgets who made him king. He forgets the men who bled for him at Granicus and Issus. We raised him higher than Olympus, and he would have us bow before him like slaves. There was silence. Then one voice whispered, If he keeps this course, the gods themselves will strike him down. One evening, as Alexander dined in his great hall, Clitus entered uninvited. He was drunk on wine and anger. The musicians stopped playing. My king, Clitus said with mock respect, I have come to toast your divinity. Alexander frowned. This is neither the time nor place, Clitus. Oh, but it is. Clitus laughed bitterly. Let us drink to the man who thinks himself a god, who forgets his father, his people, his own blood. He snatched a cup from the table and raised it high. To Alexander, son of Ammon, conqueror of men and betrayer of friends. The hall erupted in chaos. Guards moved forward, but Alexander waved them back, his face white with fury. You dare insult your king in his own hall? I dare remind him he is no king, only a Macedonian who betrayed Macedonia. Something inside Alexander broke. In one motion he seized a spear from the guard beside him and hurled it. It struck Clitus through the chest. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of the cup hitting the floor echoed like thunder. Clitus fell, eyes wide, mouth still open in protest. And then, there was only silence. Alexander stared at what he had done. The rage drained from him, leaving only horror. He dropped the spear and fell to his knees beside the body. Clitus, brother, forgive me. But Clitus could not. The man who had once saved Alexander's life at Granicus now lay dead by his hand. For 3 days Alexander shut himself in his chamber, neither eating nor speaking. Roxana waited outside, her hands folded in prayer. When at last he emerged, his eyes were hollow, his voice hoarse. I would unite the world, he said quietly, and yet I cannot master myself. He called for Clitus's body to be buried with royal honors. Then he gathered his men and spoke to them. I am not a god, he said. I am a man who carries the weight of a god's dream. If that dream destroys me, let it not destroy you. But even as he spoke, they knew something had changed. The bond between Alexander and his army, once forged in loyalty and brotherhood, had cracked. And in that crack, fate began to whisper. The spring sun of 327 BC rose over the Hindu Kush like a blade of fire. For 3 years, Alexander's armies had marched across Asia, from the sands of Egypt to the icy ridges of Bactria, and now they faced the last frontier, India, a land whispered about in legend, said to hold armies of war elephants and rivers that shone like gold. The soldiers muttered as they marched. They had buried brothers in deserts, frozen in mountain passes, and bled on every road from the Aegean to the Indus. But Alexander's eyes burned brighter than ever. The death of Clitus had hollowed him, yes, but it had also hardened him. Guilt had turned to purpose. He would not stop until the world itself had no edge left to conquer. They began their march through the treacherous mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. Snow blinded their path, mules slipped on frozen ledges, avalanches roared like angry gods. Alexander walked on foot beside his men, sharing their pain, refusing to ride while others suffered. It was this, his relentless endurance, that kept their loyalty alive, even as their faith faltered. One night when the wind tore at the way, tents and frost burned their skin, Alexander stood before his generals. You think this land is the end, he said, but beyond these mountains lies the beginning, a world untouched by Greece or Persia. If we stop now, our empire will wither. If we go on, we shall carve our names upon eternity. Hephaestion, ever his mirror and conscience, looked at him and said quietly, "Eternity may not want us, Alexander." The king only smiled. "Then we will take it." Weeks later, they descended into the lush valleys of the Swat River. After years of desert and stone, the sight of green fields and palm groves struck them like a miracle. But the miracle hid enemies, the tribes of the Aspasians and Assassinians, fierce mountain warriors who would not bend to any foreign king. The first battle came at dawn. Arrows whistled from the cliffs, drums echoed through the mist. Alexander led the charge himself, scaling the slopes with his shield held high, shouting commands through the chaos. When a javelin pierced his shoulder, he tore it free and kept fighting, blood staining his cloak. By sunset, the valley was his. He spared the wounded, rebuilt the villages, and sent gifts to their chieftains. "Let them see," he told his officers, "that the Lion of Macedon can offer both claws and mercy." Roxana, who had traveled with him since Bactria, tended to his wound in a small stone house overlooking the river. "You fight as if the gods demand it," she said. "Perhaps they do," he replied, "or perhaps I demand it of myself." As the army advanced east, they reached the Indus River, wide, glittering, and swift as a living thing. On its far bank stood the city of Taxila, ruled by King Ambi, who had long awaited Alexander's arrival. Ambi came bearing gifts, elephants adorned with gold, horses draped in silk, and baskets filled with jewels and spices. "I have watched your victories from afar," Ambi said. "Better to welcome the storm than to fight it." Alexander accepted his friendship and appointed him satrap of the region, rewarding loyalty with power. But beyond Taxila, a greater challenge awaited: the kingdom of Porus, ruler of the land beyond the Hydaspes River. Porus was no petty chief. His army was vast, his elephants trained for war, his pride unshakable. When messengers brought word of Alexander's advance, Porus sent back a single reply: "I shall greet him on the field, as a king greets a king." The Hydaspes swelled with monsoon rains when Alexander's army reached its banks. For days, both sides watched each, steaming under a merciless sun. The soldiers of Alexander, scarred, weary, and older than their years, began the long journey westward. Behind them lay India, a world of strange gods and endless battles. Ahead lay Persia, Babylon, and the distant memory of home. But between them and that dream stood the Gedrosian desert, a wasteland of salt, wind, and silence, stretching farther than the eye could see. Local guides warned him, "No army crosses Gedrosia and lives." Alexander only smiled. "Then we shall be the first." The march began under a cruel sun. The horizon shimmered with heat and the air tasted of dust. At first the men carried their supplies in great caravans, camels laden with food, skins of water, and treasure plundered from India. But soon the water ran out, wells dried to mud, beasts collapsed in the sand. Men began to drink the sweat from their own armor. The king shared their suffering. He refused special rations, drank from the same jar as his soldiers, and marched barefoot beside them. When one officer brought him a helmet filled with the last water from a dried stream, Alexander looked at it, then poured it into the sand. "If my men cannot drink, neither shall I." The gesture lifted their spirits, but not their bodies. As the days passed, heat claimed them by the hundreds. The desert swallowed the weak without mercy. Each dawn began with the sound of wind and ended with silence, as more men fell where they stood. Even the sun seemed to mock them, a blazing god that fed only on their endurance. Roxana rode at Alexander's side, her face hidden beneath a white veil. She had begged him not to take this route, to march north through fertile lands instead of this barren sea of sand. But Alexander would not turn back. "We have conquered every storm and mountain," he told her. "Shall I now bow before the earth itself?" She said nothing more, but at night she walked among the dying, giving what water she could to the wounded and burying the dead with her own hands. The soldiers began to whisper her name as a blessing, the Queen of Mercy. One evening, as the wind howled over the dunes, Roxana found Alexander standing alone on a ridge, his cloak snapping in the storm. "You lead them to death," she said softly. "No," he replied. I lead them to immortality. Immortality cannot be found in sand. Alexander turned toward her, eyes hollow yet burning. It can if the world remembers where we bled. Weeks passed. The army dwindled. Food was gone. Men chewed leather, drank their camel's blood, and cursed the gods. When they stumbled upon the skeletons of an ancient caravan half buried in sand, their bones glinting like ivory, some whispered that it was an omen. Others said it was a warning. Still, Alexander pressed on. He ordered his men to burn their wagons, keeping only what they could carry. He walked beside the last camel, his lips cracked, his armor coated with dust. The once mighty conqueror of Asia now looked more like a ghost, a man chased by his own legend. At night, he dreamed of rivers and green fields, of his youth in Pella, of the day he tamed Persepolis beneath a blue Macedonian sky. When he woke, the world was still sand and silence. Then on the 47th day of their march, the desert broke. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, rumbling like drums of the gods. The soldiers looked up in disbelief as the first drops fell, slowly at first, then in torrents. Men laughed, cried, and opened their mouths to the sky. Some fell to their knees, praising the heavens. Alexander himself lifted his face to the storm, letting the rain wash the dust from his skin. The gods have not abandoned us, he whispered. They were only testing our will. They found a valley that night where a river cut through the rock, a narrow vein of life in the heart of death. They built fires, cooked the last of their grain, and slept under thunder instead of silence. The desert had spared them, but only barely. Of the 60,000 who had begun the march, barely half remained. When the army emerged from Gedrosian, the survivors stumbled into the province of Carmania, green, fertile, alive. The people came out to greet them with food and garlands, astonished that anyone had survived the desert. Alexander ordered a festival, not of triumph, but of survival. For 7 days the army feasted and sang. They crowned their king with ivy, as if he were Dionysus returned from the east. But behind the laughter lay exhaustion. The wine could not wash away what they had seen. Hephaestion, standing beside Alexander during the celebration, said quietly, "Even the gods rest after creation." Alexander looked at the revelers, the scarred faces, the broken hands, and replied, "But I have not yet created the world I saw in my dreams." Word of their survival reached Babylon before they did. Across the empire, people hailed it as another miracle, a sign that their king was favored by heaven. But in his heart, Alexander felt only weariness. When he finally entered Babylon, the people poured into the streets, scattering flowers before him. Yet he could not smile. Every cheer reminded him of the men who had died nameless in the sand. Every laurel crown weighed heavier than his armor. In the palace gardens, he walked among fountains and palm trees, the scent of myrrh heavy in the air. Roxana joined him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "The world is yours," she said. He looked up at the stars. "Then why does it feel so empty?" She did not answer. Neither did the stars. The generals soon arrived, their loyalty eroded by distance and grief. They brought news of unrest in the provinces, rebellions in the east, rivalries in the west, satraps growing ambitious in his absence. The empire he had built was cracking, like a statue too vast to stand upon its own base. Alexander listened in silence, then said, "We shall rebuild, but not with fear, with vision." He began to plan once more. New roads, new cities, new campaigns, even a fleet to explore the seas beyond Arabia. But his body, worn thin by years of battle and exhaustion, began to fail him. The gods had given him everything and were slowly taking it back. That night, he stood on the balcony of his palace looking west. "We are returning," he said softly, "but I do not know to what." And as the wind rose from the desert, it carried with it the faint echo of all he had lost, the laughter of comrades, the hoofbeats of Persepolis, the cry of Clitus, the silence of the dead. He closed his eyes. The conqueror of the world had come home, but there was no home left to return to. Babylon, 3 BCE. The empire stood vast as the horizon, from the mountains of Macedonia to the Indus River. Yet within its heart, the man who had built it lay dying. The palace shimmered in the heat, filled with the scent of cedar oil and incense. Outside, the Euphrates drifted lazily beneath the city walls. Inside, Alexander the Great, son of Philip, conqueror of Persia, king of Asia, struggled for breath. His generals came and went like shadows, whispering in corners, measuring the future. But within the royal chamber, there was silence. Only the sound of his shallow breathing, the faint rustle of linen, and the steady gaze of Roxana, who sat beside him, her hands clasped around his. It had begun as a small thing, a fever after a banquet. They had feasted for days. Wine poured like rivers, musicians from every province filling the air with foreign melodies. Alexander had seemed unstoppable, still planning new conquests, Arabia, perhaps even Carthage. Then came the cough. Then the burning. Then the night when he could no longer rise from his bed. Physicians crowded his chamber, each with their potions and charms. They burned herbs, poured milk over bronze bowls, whispered prayers to Asclepius. Nothing worked. The fever deepened. Hephaestion was long dead, his absence now a shadow at the edge of the bed, a ghost Alexander could almost see. Roxana begged him to rest, to let others rule for a time. But Alexander only smiled faintly. "The world waits for no man," he whispered. "Even for kings?" she asked. "Especially for kings." Word of his illness spread like wildfire through Babylon. The generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Perdiccas, Antipater's envoys, gathered outside the palace gates, their faces grim. They feared not only his death but what would follow it. No heir was ready. His son by Roxana was unborn, and the empire was held together by his will alone. When they were finally summoned, the sight stunned them. Alexander, gaunt and drenched in sweat, still wore his royal diadem. His voice was barely audible, yet his eyes burned with the same terrible intensity they had seen on battlefields from Issus to Hydaspes. "You think I am dying," he said, "but gods do not die. They ascend." He looked upon them one by one, the men who had followed him across continents, who had bled and killed in his name. "When I am gone, divide nothing. Rule as one. The dream is not yet finished." Then he leaned back, exhausted, the fire dimming behind his eyes. Afterward, they left the chamber in silence, knowing that unity would not survive him. As the fever worsened, Alexander asked to be carried to the river. They placed him on a litter of gold and silk, and slowly bore him through the palace gardens. The soldiers lined the path, silent as statues. When he reached the banks of the Euphrates, he asked to be lifted from the litter. His legs could no longer hold him, but he insisted. Roxana and a few guards helped him to stand. The cool wind brushed his face. He looked out over the river that flowed west, toward the lands he had not yet conquered. "I thought I would see the edge of the world," he murmured. "But the world has no edge, only circles, and the river always returns to the sea." He touched the water with trembling fingers, then let it drip from his hand. "So this is how the gods drink," he said softly, "from the same river as men." When they carried him back, he no longer spoke. The silence of the king for 3 days, he drifted between life and death. Roxana never left his side. She wiped his brow, whispered prayers, and told him stories from her homeland, of Bactrian mountains and almond trees in bloom. Once, in a moment of clarity, he opened his eyes and said her name. "Roxana," he breathed. "Do you remember when we stood in the desert, when the world was only sand and stars?" "I remember," she whispered. "Then remember me as I was, not as I am." He reached for her hand, but the strength failed. His fingers slipped from hers, falling limp against the sheets. By nightfall, his voice was gone. On the 10th day of his illness, the generals gathered once more. The soldiers demanded to see their king, to know if he still lived. So they carried him to the hall, pale and motionless, resting on a couch of gold. As the troops filed past, tens of thousands in silence, Alexander raised his hand weakly, a final gesture. The men fell to their knees, tears cutting through the dust on their faces. It was the last time he ever moved. When he was taken back to his chamber, he whispered only one thing to Perdiccas, the loyal general who leaned close to hear him. "To whom do you leave the empire, my king?" asked Perdiccas. "To the strongest," Alexander breathed. Then at the hour before dawn, the conqueror of the world closed his eyes and was still. The news struck the empire like thunder. Babylon fell into chaos. Soldiers tore at their clothes, women wailed in the streets, and the generals began to whisper of succession. Within days, alliances shattered. The strongest began to fight for the world he left behind. Roxana, heavy with child, ordered the palace sealed. She knew what came next, blood. And when she gave birth to a son, Alexander IV, she held the child in her arms and whispered, "The world will try to break you as it broke him. Remember his dream, not his crown." But even that dream would fade with time. The empire fractured. The generals carved it into kingdoms. And the name Alexander became legend, half god, half ghost, echoing across the centuries.